Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will be walking you through the results of our annual State of Third-Party Risk Management Survey, giving insight into how your peers are managing third-party risk and the best practices you should follow for 2023. Our white paper covering the results is hot off the presses, and we're very excited to provide a copy to everyone here on the webinar today as it covers the results in depth. To grab your copy, go to the Related Content widget, and you'll see a link named State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 White Paper. You'll also see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our 10 reasons for a third-party risk budget infographic, our vendor performance metrics ebook and scorecard template, our training new vendor owners checklist, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. Today we are talking about our 7th annual State of Third-Party Risk Survey. And there's a lot to cover here, but we're going to start with some basic information about the survey, and then we'll get into the actual results. We'll wrap up today with some best practices and some Q&A, so let's get into the survey. Well, to begin, we promoted our 7th annual survey through our third-party think tank and through social media from November 2022 through January 2023. And we allowed everyone to provide anonymous answers to make sure they felt comfortable answering the questions and could just really tell it like it is. The survey covered a really wide variety of organizations from an industry standpoint and a size standpoint. We had financial services, retail, fintech, food services, insurance, and healthcare. All of the sizes of the companies, both in terms and assets, also varied quite a bit. We had sizes ranging from less than $1 billion and 100 employees to more than $10 billion and more than 5,000 employees. Now, we typically ask the same questions each year, but that doesn't mean that the results are always the same. And each year, we like to share some of the key insights from the survey. Well, this year, here are a few things we'd like to share. First of all, more organizations are developing or using third-party risk program metrics now. And guess what? Cybersecurity is still the #1 concern for third-party risk management programs. The good news is that third-party risk management is really starting to help organizations avoid supply chain disruptions, which have been a constant challenge for a few years now. We also learned that the majority of our programs are using dedicated third-party risk management software and platforms, and that the vendor business continuity is a major priority for most organizations. We also learned that outsourcing, even though it's a great and viable option, is still underused. All right, let's jump into the actual questions and results now. Now, one of the things that we're always interested in is how many people are supporting third-party risk management programs. Now, this year we saw some pretty consistent numbers from previous years, and 52% of our participants said they had 2 or fewer dedicated FTE. Now, while that number seems low, it's actually encouraging because last year we still had 24% of organizations that reported they had no dedicated employees, and this year that number has dropped to 13%. Still, 2 or few might seem like it's not enough, but we also have to consider how mature those programs are, how many vendors they're managing, and if they're using tools and technology that can help them be more efficient. Still, there are some programs that have more than 20 FTE, but those are fairly rare at only 8%. And it doesn't seem that common to have a very large third-party risk management staff. Now let's explore where these teams are reporting in their organizations. And I think it's pretty encouraging that about 40% of teams, these third-party risk management teams, are reporting to either a risk department or a compliance department. And that's really encouraging because third-party risk management is, after all, a risk discipline. And it's nice to see these teams being recognized as such and integrated and aligned under risk management departments. We do still see a large portion of third-party risk management teams that are aligned under either IT or information security departments, about 23% altogether. 16% of those are reporting to information security, which is also a risk management discipline, but one that is more limited in scope than third-party risk management in general. And although the numbers are smaller, we're still seeing teams reporting into finance, procurement, and legal. However, we are seeing 13% of the teams reporting into multiple departments. And this can be a little tricky because it might affect the overall effectiveness of the program if the management focus is distributed. Anyone who's been in the third-party risk management business for any time will certainly be familiar with the challenges related to getting that vendor owner and that business line support for TPRM. As a matter of fact, 76% find it challenging but also manageable, and 13% find it very difficult. And this seems to be the age-old story, and it would sure be interesting to know how that 11% did not find it difficult at all and how they are navigating that particular challenge. Is it a matter of senior management sending the right message, or do they have a magic formula? I'm not really sure, but what I do know is that senior management does play a huge role in how third-party risk management is perceived and respected across the organization. So when the board and senior leadership prioritize third-party risk management and integrate it into their business decisions, we do see that friction between the line of business and third-party risk management decrease. Likewise, when third-party risk management is recognized as an essential risk management discipline and is funded appropriately, it also sends a message to the organization that third-party risk management is not just a check-the-box activity. And speaking of funding, there is a slight increase in program investment. Last year, 26% of our respondents were spending less than $10,000 compared to only 20% this year. But it still seems a good amount of respondents are in that $50,000 to $100,000 range. The truth is we're just not seeing a lot of increases in budget, and it's not surprising because a lot of organizations are dealing with a very challenging economy, and our survey doesn't really indicate how third-party risk management budgets stack up against other management budgets within an organization. But as you consider your own organization and how third-party risk management is funded, it's important that third-party risk management budgets are not targeted for reductions when other budgets are not. After all, it is an essential function and should be resourced appropriately, and that makes sure that there's enough budget and dollars to do that. And while we're thinking about budgets, we are ready for our first poll of the day. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, compared to previous years, our third-party risk management budget in 2022 was higher than the previous year, lower than the previous year, about the same as the previous year, or you don't know. Hillary, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
Okay.
And that question is, what division or department should third-party risk management report to ideally?
Well, I think the key word here is ideally, and we need to remember that all organizations are stretched differently, but in a perfect world, third-party risk management should report up to your general risk division, whether that's enterprise risk or that's layered under compliance. And the reason for that is because enterprise risk, is looking at what's going on across the company and external influencers as well. And that's exactly what third-party risk management is doing, just in a different way. One of the reasons I really advocate for third-party risk management to report into risk divisions is because it is a risk discipline, and it needs to have a seat at the table for risk committees, etc. But that's not to say that there aren't plenty of organizations that have their third-party risk management teams report into, finance even, or information security. It's just most important that there is a clear third-party risk management structure and that they're getting the right amount of support and visibility no matter where they sit in the organization. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slide widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, while we're on the topic of budget, I would like to remind you that in the related content widget, you'll find our 10 reasons for a third-party risk budget infographic. With that, Hillary, back to you.
An important consideration for funding and resourcing our teams is how many vendors are under management. Just how big are the populations that need to be managed? Of course, because the sizes and types of responding organizations vary, we have a lot of difference in vendor populations. A cumulative 20% have less than 100 vendors, and yeah, that would be a pretty small program. But another good portion, 28% in fact, are managing 100 to 300 vendors. Programs come in all sizes, of course, and we had 11% that are dealing with more than 1,000 vendors. And while the number of vendors under management is a great data point, where it becomes very meaningful is how it relates to your organization and if you have enough resources to effectively manage that population. Your vendor inventory can give you a lot of really valuable information, especially when you look at it by risk level. For example, if you have a high number of critical vendors, that might indicate it's time to refine your criteria for critical. Or if you have an excessive number of low-risk vendors that are providing essentially the same products and services, it might be time for a better procurement strategy. After all, each organization is different. And speaking of those critical vendors, as a best practice, critical vendors should not make up more than 15% of your total vendor inventory. And it looks like a majority of our survey respondents are right in that sweet spot. Still, we have those organizations that are exceeding that 15% or don't really know how many critical vendors they have. Having more than 15% might indicate a few things. One, that the organization is using critical as a risk level versus an identifier of those vendors that are most essential to their business organizations, right? Because critical is not a risk rating. Or it could indicate that the criteria for critical is too broad and must be refined to ensure that the truly critical vendors are getting the right attention in risk management. So there's more than just one way to manage third-party risk management, and organizations have different models for doing so. We're always curious about which model they're choosing, and nowadays 60% are using a centralized model where the third-party risk management team is responsible for all the risk management activities. versus the 29% that are using hybrid solutions that depend on a third-party risk management team to establish the framework, tools, and processes, but that require vendor owners on the line of business to manage the risk of their vendors. Now, I can certainly understand why centralized models have been increasing in popularity, and 48% of the population. But with the constant struggle between vendor owners and the line of business and TPRM, it may be that organizations are choosing to just centralize the responsibility for vendor risk with an established team of experts. It just may be more efficient that way. Still, we are 1% that are decentralized, which means those responsibilities are scattered across the organization. When we see a decentralized model, we often assume it's because the program is fairly new, and as it matures, it will typically take on a different model to optimize the process. Of course, the tools used for managing vendor risk are relevant to how effective and efficient the practices are and how many resources are needed to manage them. So 64% of our survey said that they're now using a dedicated vendor risk management program or software, and that is excellent news because that means organizations are taking advantage of process automation, centralized communication and document collection, workflow organization, and scheduling of important tasks like risk reassessment and performance monitoring. For those not using a dedicated system, another 18% are using a module designed to manage third-party risk management that is housed within another system, such as a GRC or enterprise risk management system. Of course, there are many benefits to having all your risk disciplines integrated into the same system, but there can also be disadvantages as many of these modules have not always been designed to handle the number of complex processes and inputs and outputs that third-party risk management really demands. Of course, we still have those using manual processes such as Excel, SharePoint, etc., which can work but tend to be more error-prone and less efficient than dedicated systems designed to handle that process end-to-end. As we mentioned earlier, knowing who your critical vendors are is essential for effective third-party risk management, and that means having standardized criteria to help you identify them. The good news is that 80%, an overwhelming majority, do have those processes in place. There are some 15% that do not and 5% that are not sure, and hopefully those organizations will spend time this year nailing down the criteria for critical and implementing it as a standard. Because this is an essential requirement in many organizations, it's also a regulatory requirement. And to go hand in hand with identifying critical vendors, we also need a process to identify the types and amounts of risk present in the products and services we're getting from our vendors. And we refer to this as the inherent risk assessment, practice of identifying and assessing those risks before we consider any potential mitigating controls. The good news is 79% of organizations place. But what about the 21% that don't have them or don't know? Well, we could assume that maybe it's because there are newer programs and those processes have yet to be developed. In any case, regulators and best practices dictate that inherent risk assessments are foundational to the third-party risk management process. If we don't know the risks, it's going to be pretty hard to manage them. We also asked the question about residual risk and if organizations have a process to determine it. A good portion, 62% of organizations do. But the truth is this is still an emerging practice for many organizations. And residual risk can be a confusing concept because if it's not well understood how a residual risk rating should be applied. What's important to remember is that residual risk is always a way to measure the risk that's left over after you've applied those controls, and it should help you determine if the risk mitigation was sufficient or not. I do always want to reiterate that we never use residual risk scores in place of inherent risk scores. An inherent risk score provides the information for how we should manage and monitor that vendor throughout its lifetime. And when it comes to managing and monitoring vendor risk, we're also very interested to know how often organizations are reassessing those vendor risk profiles in due diligence documentation. Of course, the cadence should vary depending on the risk presented in the engagement, but best practices dictate that for critical and high-risk vendors, this process is performed at least annually. Fortunately, most of our organizations are doing just that, and some are even doing it more frequently in some cases. Remember, risk profiles do change, so it is necessary to periodically reassess and evaluate that risk. If there are any changes, they do need to be addressed through a thorough review. And along with those periodic reviews, we need to make sure we always have the most current due diligence documents available. Let's turn our attention to policies and how often they are getting updated. Regulatory requirements and best practices tell us that it's necessary to review these policies at least once a year and update them when necessary. And 65% of our population is doing just that, but that number is in decline from 79% the previous year. To go hand in hand with that, we're seeing a slight increase in the organizations that are reviewing every 1 to 3 years. At this point, I think it's fair to remind everyone that your policy is the document that formalizes your rules and requirements. And if it's not reflecting your current practices or is not in line with current regulatory expectations, that can be the reason you get an audit or exam finding. So make sure to update these and now, we're always talking an awful lot about how much risk changes in the third-party risk management world. And as such, our methodology for identifying those risks need to keep pace. That means that we're reviewing and updating our inherent vendor risk assessments at least once a year to ensure that it's capturing current risks. More than half of our organizations are updating their inherent risk assessments at least once a year, and 20% are doing it every year or two. The recommendation here is to review your inherent risk assessment on an annual basis to ensure that it's capturing any new or emerging risk. There are plenty of reasons for this, but if you think about some of the biggest risks that we might encounter now, they come as a result of things like fourth parties or those extended vendor relationships. That wasn't even on the radar like it is today. So make it an annual practice to review your inherent risk assessment and update it when necessary. So similar to those inherent risk assessments, we need to make sure that the risks we're trying to identify and manage are also reflected in our vendor risk questionnaires or that due diligence questionnaire, and that we're evaluating the type of due diligence documents that we require periodically. As with most things, the third-party risk management recommendation for this is to do it at least once a year, and 60% of our organizations do. But cumulatively, 12% are waiting 3 or more years to update their vendor risk questionnaires and due diligence document requirements. Keep in mind that your vendor is not likely to disclose their risk practices or controls when they're not asked to. And an outdated vendor risk questionnaire and due diligence document increases the chances that you're going to have risks that go unidentified and unmanaged. Third-party risk management has been around for about 30 years, maybe more, depending on who you ask. So how mature are our programs? Well, we can see that 25% of the population is in some stage of initial development and implementation, and another 39% has well-established policy and program, but they're still working on improvements. 31% say they have a fully established policy and program and everything is implemented. It's important to realize that even as we mature our programs and processes, that constant improvement should always be a standing objective. There is no perfect program, but it's nice to see that overall, third-party risk management is really maturing. So how do you know it's time to improve the program even if everything is up and running? Well, here are a few indicators. First of all, if your core documents such as your policy, program, or procedures are outdated, or if the users are finding them really hard to follow. And if your stakeholders are confused by any of your workflows, or there's a low level of program compliance, those are two big indicators that improvements might be necessary right away. But let's think about our vendor due diligence and risk questionnaires. You know, when those questions are poorly worded or we're constantly having to explain what it is that we need in that question, that's a big sign that we need some improvement. If you're severely backlogged and you can't get the work done with the resources you have, it might be time to reevaluate and see where you can make some changes, either to improve efficiency or reduce manual processes, etc. And if your program has been rolling along for a few years and you still don't really provide any meaningful reporting for your stakeholders, it's time to ask why. Keep in mind that everything from internal compliance to decision making should be influenced by the data you provide. So make sure that your stakeholders have the necessary information, that it's current and accessible. And of course, last but not least, if you're getting audit or exam findings, it's definitely time to tune up your program. You know, it's not unusual for an organization to focus solely on regulatory compliance when thinking about the reasons they have third-party risk management. You know, while regulatory compliance can be a primary driver, it is not the only benefit that third-party risk management brings to the organization. And that's why it's important to identify and implement specific metrics that can help you measure the health, stability, and effectiveness of your third-party risk management program. 20% of our population already have these metrics in place, and another 16% are developing them. 24% said they have some, but they're not comprehensive. No, they probably need some work. And another 16% are working towards them in the future. So roughly 2/3 of our population understand the importance of these metrics and either have them in place or are working to implement them. But remember, these kind of program metrics can not only demonstrate the value and benefits of third-party risk management, but they can also help your senior leaders and other stakeholders understand if there's systemic risks in the program, such as low internal compliance, or if there are insufficient resources to effectively execute the processes. These metrics can be extremely important for your board and senior leadership. So if you haven't started developing them, now is a great time to get started.
Our second poll question of the day is, in 2022, did your organization change the number of full-time employees supporting your third-party risk management program? Yes, we added full-time employees. Yes, we lost full-time employees. No changes, or not sure. Hillary, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer.
Okay.
Great. Should we be conducting full risk assessments on fourth parties, making them fill out a risk survey and getting their documents, etc.?
Here's the thing about fourth parties. So the first thing to remember is that you do not have a direct relationship with them. You do not have a contract with them, and you do not have an NDA with them. So it's not super likely that they're going to start turning over all of this information to you. The second thing is that it's not really your role to be assessing your fourth parties. That is the responsibility of your third party. So considering all fourth parties, one thing we really need to understand is how our vendors manage their third-party risks. So we want to obviously look at their practices and controls. And for those fourth parties, especially ones that are providing services that are critical to your vendor's ability to provide services to you, we definitely want our third parties to show us their risk assessments, their due diligence results, their monitoring for those vendors. There are very rare cases where you can actually work with your vendor to conduct additional due diligence, but just keep in mind it is always the responsibility of your third party to manage their vendors. It's your responsibility to make sure that they're doing that in a way that's acceptable to your organization. So no, you shouldn't be asking for risk assessments and everything, or you shouldn't be giving them directly to the fourth parties. That's your vendor's job. I hope that makes sense for everyone.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget, where you will find our Vendor Performance Metrics ebook and scorecard template. This is a handy resource to download if you're looking to improve your understanding of vendor performance metrics. Okay, Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
So how are we doing when we get audits or regulatory exams? Well, 7% didn't get any audits or exams in the last year, and 15% weren't really sure. But for those who did, 37% reported no findings, which is excellent and does say a lot about program maturity and effectiveness. But, another 28 leaders and examiners that improvements are necessary. Of course, nobody likes to have findings, but they're not unusual. Just remember that audits and exams are just another component in a healthy business process, and independent reviews make our programs better. It seems like we were always under pressure to improve our third-party risk management programs, and survey respondents agreed as 71% indicated they were feeling some pressure to improve. What's interesting is where that pressure is coming from. 29% said the pressure was coming from regulators and their auditors and examiners. But what's interesting is 38% said the pressure was internal from senior management or the board. And this is a little different than previous years, as the regulatory pressure has traditionally been the number one source. But the fact that internal management and the board are exerting this pressure is a really good sign, and it indicates more involvement from the top. I also want to point out that 4% said the pressure was coming from their clients, and this is an improving or an increasing area of focus as well. Still, 29% said they weren't feeling any pressure, which is interesting since third-party risks are always changing and evolving, and it makes sense that our programs need to change and evolve also. Now let's look at that scrutiny from auditors and regulators. 69% of organizations said they were getting more scrutiny from regulators and auditors. Now, compared to other years, 2022 was not particularly active from a regulatory standpoint in the third-party risk management space. That's not to say that there isn't a lot of pending regulatory requirements and a lot that are being developed every day. Still, we did have some, like the SEC Safeguards Rule, which required covered entities such as mortgage companies and auto dealerships to develop and implement cybersecurity programs for the first time, and those programs also included third-party risk management. Still, 27% felt the same amount of scrutiny, and only 4% said they felt less. I guess it's fair to say that if you've been in the third-party risk management game for a while, you know the drill. Regulatory scrutiny is just part of your day-to-day. So let's talk about the risk environment for a minute and which areas of new and emerging risks were most important for organizations. Now, we asked people to select all the answers that apply, so it's no surprise that cybersecurity is still the number one concern for most organizations. 70% said that increased cybersecurity controls is the most relevant risk area, and that's followed by vendor business continuity planning, which is now in the number 2 spot, up from number 3 last year. Of course, as we just mentioned in the previous slide, regulations loom large in our collective third-party risk management mind. And as we're still waiting on regulators to finalize like the interagency guidance from the OCC, FDIC, and FRB, it's not surprising that this is in the number 3 spot. Other notable concerns are digital at 38% and 35% are concerned about ESG disclosure and reporting. There just aren't a lot of surprises here. Cybersecurity, regulatory compliance, and business continuity have typically been the forerunners on the third-party risk management concerns. Speaking of cybersecurity, we know that attacks have gone up significantly and that healthcare and financial services have been hit particularly hard. The good news is that 50% of our survey participants had no cybersecurity instances during 2022. Another 32% did have them, but they were very limited impact incidents. 3% had moderate, and only 1% had high impact incidents. We might be able to attribute this to the ever-increasing focus on cybersecurity at our organizations and with our vendors. And it's also fair to say that robust third-party risk management is instrumental in reducing the frequency and severity of these attacks. So what controls are we looking for to manage third-party cyber risk? Well, cybersecurity awareness training came in first at 88%, beating all other controls. Multi-factor authentication came in as a tight second, and ongoing monitoring and third. Now, if we look at these numbers objectively, it seems that many organizations are using effective tools to help them reduce this third-party risk. But it's encouraging that ongoing monitoring is in the number 3 spot, showing once again that it pays to pay attention and keep your eyes on the vendor. Since we've discussed the controls that are in place for cybersecurity, how confident are we in them? Well, 74% indicated that they were either confident or very confident in those controls. And considering that only 1% of those surveys had a high impact cybersecurity event last year, they probably have a good reason for feeling confident. So we have 17% that are just not confident in those controls. Hopefully that portion of the population is actively working with their cybersecurity and information security teams to develop more effective controls in the future. Cybersecurity is certainly a huge risk, but more than ever, supply chain disruption is garnering greater attention. The good news is it seems that third-party risk management may also be effective in reducing the frequency and severity of these interruptions, as only 2% of the population had high-impact supply chain incidents. 9% had moderate, 39% had very limited, and a full 31% had no incidents at all. When it comes to supply chain interruptions, it's really important to understand the impact of fourth, fifth, and other extended parties and how they affect the delivery of products and services to your organization. We were curious to find out how organizations are actually assessing subcontractors or those fourth-party relationships, either directly or by reviewing their vendor's third-party risk management program. So the results here are a little more mixed. 34% said yes, 41% said somewhat. We can look at the mix of the vendors that were evaluated to see that 60% were really only reviewing critical and high-risk vendors, which makes sense as those vendor relationships are the ones with the greatest potential to impact your organization. You know, many products and services today are dependent on multiple vendors throughout the supply chain. So it is necessary to investigate how your vendors risk assess, monitor, and manage their vendors, and so on. So as supply chain interruption is an increasing risk, it makes sense that organizations are evolving and changing to address those risks. We asked our participants to let us know if they've made any changes, and if so, what changes were made. And more than half didn't make any changes to their existing process in response to supply chain interruption. But consistent with what we have seen throughout the survey, 33% have put more focus on business continuity and disaster recovery, both for their own organization and the vendor. Of course, assessing critical vendors is essential, and 30% of our respondents felt the same way. Updating incident responses, business continuity, and disaster recovery plans is another way that organizations are responding to supply chain disruptions. From there, we're looking at reviewing subcontractor fourth-party assessments and implementing ESG for third-party vendors. So is third-party risk management really helping organizations avoid supply chain disruptions? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, and the jury might be still out on this one. 40% said yes, 38% are unsure, and a full 20% just said no. It may be that we really don't know how effective our efforts are until there's been a failure. But in the meantime, an ounce of prevention is always worth a pound of cure, as they say. ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, is another area that's been developing as a third-party risk management concern. Still, considering that there's very few actual regulations for ESG in the United States, it's really not surprising that only 29% responded that they were assessing their vendors and their subcontractors for ESG compliance. But this is a space to really watch as pressure is increasing from investors and the general public. And many organizations may find the need to integrate third-party risk management in ESG well before any U.S. regulations are established. Supplier diversity is a business objective and requirement for many organizations today, especially those that perform services for the federal government, military, or other institutions that have specific diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives. 11% of our survey population did have these processes in place, Well, another 30% were somewhere in the development stage. Still, 40% were not collecting any vendor diversity status as part of the vendor's profile. A popular part of our annual survey always addresses the top third-party risk management challenges. And this year, like so many before, getting the right vendor documents and having enough internal resources are in spots 1 and 2. Last year, they tied for the top spot, and they've ranked first and second, alternating back and forth for several years in a row. Another growing challenge is automating the process of third-party risk management. And this makes sense as many organizations are moving away from manual processes and engaging with dedicated third-party risk management software or management modules that sit within GRC or enterprise risk management platforms. We know that the success or failure of third-party risk management within an organization strongly depends on the amount and quality of third-party risk management training that stakeholders receive. We also know from past experience that friction between the line of business and a third-party risk management team can often be attributed to insufficient training and knowledge transfer. So we're interested to understand how organizations are training their vendor owners in particular to perform their third-party risk management duties. 27% are doing personal instruction with a third-party risk management team member. Another 24% are just kind of handing over the basic instructions and procedures. And only 8% are using formalized instructor-led training, and another 9% use self-service training. While all these methods have their pros and cons, it's essential to make sure that vendor owners are adequately trained how to perform their third-party risk management roles and responsibilities. Unfortunately, we still have 17% of organizations that are not training their vendor owners at all, and another 10% that aren't sure. Now it's time to consider outsourcing and how it's being used or not used by organizations to supplement their third-party risk management teams. Now, as we consider the numbers here, I want to remind everyone that just a few slides ago, we said that getting the right documents from vendors and having enough internal resources were the top 2 third-party risk management challenges. And 20% of our respondents are actually outsourcing due diligence document collection. Another 16% are outsourcing their vendor risk assessments. And both of these are excellent use cases for outsourcing, as document collection is very time intensive. You know, of course it's necessary, but it's a relatively low value activity when you have very limited resources. On the other hand, vendor risk reviews require a high level of expertise that just may not exist in every organization. You know, 21% reported using outsourcing, but only for a portion of the portfolio, which can also make sense. You know, maybe they're outsourcing activities for managing lower risk relationships. Still, 54% are not taking advantage of outsourcing at all. Now, personally, I have to giggle a little bit when I think about this, because in my experience, third-party risk management teams are often the ones that are most hesitant to outsource their own processes. In any case, outsourcing can be a really valuable resource that can give you access to expertise that doesn't exist in-house, and it can help you make better use of your limited resources. We know that third-party risk management has a very strong regulatory component and that it's the #1 driver for most organizations. However, it's also important to ask if we believe that there is a return on investment for third-party risk management. 60% of those surveyed said yes, which means the money and resources invested are worthwhile and provide benefits to the organization. 13% said no, and 19% were unsure. Just to go back to that topic of third-party risk management program metrics, they can be very helpful in quantifying that ROI. And while many of us believe that there's an actual ROI on third-party risk management, being able to articulate that benefit requires that an organization makes a cultural shift away from practices that only calculate hard dollars when determining ROI. Although some benefits might be difficult to calculate into pure financial equations, it's clear what can happen when third-party risk management is not implemented or performed ineffectively. Data breaches are a perfect example. So as you've seen, our survey has covered a lot of territory. but we were most interested in why organizations practice third-party risk management in the first place. Unsurprisingly, the number one answer was regulatory compliance, and the number two answer was that it's a best practice. It's encouraging, if not a bit surprising, to see protecting the reputation come in at number three, even above avoiding cybersecurity incidents. But quality assurance and cost control were also big drivers for third-party risk management. Again, every organization has different motivations and objectives for their third-party risk management program. And hopefully, organizations have begun to have motivations that expand beyond just pure regulatory compliance and following best practices. And now it is time for our last poll of the day. Jessie?
Our next poll question is, in 2022, did your senior management issue any formal communications regarding the importance of third-party risk management at your organization? Yes, no, or not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
Okay.
It is the business practice at my company to formally review and reissue policies every 2 years. Will we get in trouble if we put the vendor risk policy on that schedule, or do we have to do it every year?
All right, well, here's what's going on. So we have the requirements, and again, in these regulatory requirements, where we're really getting this information are from the guidance documents, which means they are guidelines, and they do recommend or request that you are reviewing and updating that policy on an annual basis. However, if your entire organization has a different structure, it may not make sense for you to upend the apple cart just for one policy. What I would recommend is to discuss it with your senior management. Say this is the requirement. Should we be doing this off cycle? Also to reiterate the other requirements that, once a year the board should be getting an update about third-party risk management, for example. That's not something we want to do every 2 years. So whereas if you have a defined structure and that's the way it's going to be, I think you can articulate that to an auditor or examiner. But what's more important is that if there are significant changes in your organization or material regulatory changes or updates, that you do an off-cycle review of that policy. But if at all possible, try and get it to that annual review cycle. Okay?
Here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. A few slides back, we covered vendor owner training. In our related content widget, you'll also find our training new vendor owners checklist, which will help your team prepare new and existing vendor owners to fulfill their roles and responsibilities successfully.
So happy that you joined us today to review our annual survey, and I hope you got a lot of information out of it. If nothing else, you can just see how you stack up against your peers. But before we go to our final Q&A today, I just want to share some best practices for third-party risk management in 2023 and beyond. First of all, we have to staff our teams with skilled and experienced people. All the technology and process efficiency in the world is not going to substitute for people who don't know what they're doing. We have to have well-documented and current governance documents such as our policy, program, and procedures, and we should be reviewing and updating them at least once a year. Speaking of updates, we need to keep all of our assessments, questionnaires, and due document requirements up to date and relevant to the current risk environment. We need to educate our vendor owners and our management on the purpose and objectives of third-party risk management. We must make sure that they're trained to accomplish the tasks to fulfill their responsibilities. We want to monitor and track vendor issues through remediation, and we want to measure the impact of our programs through program metrics and reviews. That means keeping senior management well informed And finally, last but not least, stay on top of industry news and enforcement actions. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie. Jessie?
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time and sharing some really important information. Also, be on the lookout for our 2023 webinar schedule. We will be adding webinars to our website over the next several weeks at venminder.com/webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, should third-party risk managers be the ones to identify what controls vendors need?
No, they don't need to be the ones that identify the controls. The controls really should be identified by the subject matter experts as part of the vendor risk assessment. Vendor owners just need to make sure that their vendors are participating, returning their due diligence questionnaires, and providing the most updated due diligence documentation.
Great. Next question. It is the business practice at my company to formally review and reissue policies every 2 years. Will we get in trouble if we put the vendor risk policy on that schedule, or do we have to do it every year?
You won't necessarily get in trouble, but it is important to follow the guidance if you're regulated, and that is once a year. I think this just really merits a discussion with your management. If they feel like it's important to keep everything on the same schedule, then you'll just need to be documenting that and keep it handy in case your auditors or examiners ask.
Great. Next question. We don't have any program metrics right now, but want to develop them. What is the best way to do that?
So when you're developing your program metrics, it's really important to understand the objectives that your company has for third-party risk management in the first place. So a good starting point is if you want to just be about regulatory compliance, you want to look for the program metrics that are going to support regulatory compliance. Like, are you doing, due diligence reviews and risk reviews? Are you managing vendor performance, et cetera? Now, there's a lot we could get into on this, but the best place to start is to really identify 3 to 5 of your company's objectives and kind of cascade down from that. I'll look at the steps or activities in the life cycle that you can measure that will best support that. You can look at things like internal compliance. You can look at sort of the ratio of vendors to third-party risk management team. There's all sorts of ways to do that, but you do need to take a top-down approach.
Great. Next question. How can third-party risk management program metrics help us get more resources?
Well, just like I had mentioned, if you start using data to show the stakeholders and management what it is that you're really up against. So let's say that we have, a population of 1,000 vendors, and we've seen an uptick in critical and high vendors by 30% over the previous year. We know that those vendor relationships take a lot more effort and time to manage, and it's really difficult to do that on the existing resources that we have. So it's really about using data to support what your requests are. If you're feeling like you need more FTE, then I would structure the data that way. More resources can come in terms of money for technology or to even outsource some of your processes of risk reviews. Just remember, you need to tell the right story with your data to support that request for resources.
Perfect. Our next question. Should we be conducting full risk assessments on fourth parties, making them fill out a risk survey, and getting their documents, etc.?
No. No, you shouldn't. I think we addressed this earlier in the presentation, but you don't have a direct relationship with those vendors, and so it's going to be very difficult for you to obligate them to give you any information. What you need to do is make sure that your third parties, the ones who are directly responsible for that, are managing that process efficiently. You want to look at their third-party risk management process. And if you have a fourth party that you're interested in, ask your third party to provide evidence of their risk assessment, due diligence, and monitoring.
Great. Okay, next question here. How many critical vendors should an enterprise ideally have? Example, should it be 10% of total vendors, or what would you suggest?
Now, generally speaking, that number is around 15%. And if you ask me where that baseline came from, I don't know that I can honestly tell you, except for that's the number that we've been bouncing around with. What we want to keep in mind here is that your critical vendors are the ones that are absolutely mission critical to running your day-to-day operations. And so if you're finding that you have a larger percentage than that, it's just a good indicator that you need to review your criteria and review the vendors that were deemed critical, just to go back and double check, because we don't want to disproportionately weight that vendor inventory with critical vendors, because again, remember, these take all the time and resources to manage. You should be updating your board on those critical vendors. There's a lot at stake with your critical vendors. So the most important thing is not as much the percentage, is that they've been correctly identified.
Wonderful. Next question. Could you please define a centralized model?
Yeah, so a centralized model in third-party risk management is where all the third-party risk management roles and responsibilities are kind of taking place within the same department. So, for example, in a hybrid model, you have a third-party risk management team who owns the framework and sets up all the rules, tools, processes, and requirements. And then individuals in the line of business are actually managing those vendor relationships. In a centralized model, you probably have the third-party risk management team setting up everything, but you also may have dedicated individuals responsible for managing that vendor risk. So the last model that we mentioned was decentralized, where there's bits and pieces all over the organization. I hope that helps.
That's great. Our next question. What are the benefits of residual risk if we want to be more conservative?
I'm not sure I understand the question 100%, but let me just give the try here. So with residual risk, again, it's only an indicator of how confident you are in your controls, and if the risk remediation has been satisfactory. So for example, your inherent risk is high, you put in all the controls, you consider all the risk management practices of the vendor, and it still comes out as high risk. At that point, you need to determine if you're still comfortable with that level of risk, or if more or different remediation efforts are necessary. When it comes to being more conservative, your organization completely sets its own risk appetite, and your residual risk, really, it shouldn't shift your position there. It should just reinforce that you're making the right choices.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary as well for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on this site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of Vendor, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.